This program is brought to you by the Vegetarian Society of Hawaii, a nonprofit organization dedicated to sharing with the community the many benefits of a vegetarian diet. Free monthly meetings include vegetarian experts found locally and on the mainland, quick and easy cooking demonstrations, and healthful and delicious food samples. Members enjoy an informative quarterly newsletter, social activities, and discounts at many vegetarian-friendly restaurants and health food stores. For an application, call 944-8344. That's 944-8344. Or visit our website at www.vsh.org. vsh.org.
This podium comes with a gavel, so we may as well hear what it sounds like. Welcome everybody to this monthly public lecture of the Vegetarian Society of Hawaii. I'm really glad, and I think we all are, that the weather eased up this afternoon, or else I think there'd be a smaller number of us here today. I'd like to remind you of the organization and mission of the Vegetarian Society. Founded in 1990, the Vegetarian Society is a not-for-profit volunteer organization. It's run by volunteers. Everybody's a volunteer except for a bookkeeper. It has three purposes: to promote human health, animal rights, and the protection of the environment by means of vegetarian education. We are an educational society. It is the largest local vegetarian society in the United States with more than 1,600 members. This is the largest. We'd like to encourage you to join the Vegetarian Society. Members receive an informative newsletter that lets you know what's happening, tells you about social events that we're up to, and you get nice discounts, 5 or 10%, at many vegetarian-friendly restaurants and health food stores, including Down to Earth and Huckleberry Farm. Our March speaker is here in attendance. Park J.O., famous lawyer in Korea, is back to attend Dr. Shapiro's seminar with his wife, Kum Hyung, and this time they have brought their 3 children. So now it's time to introduce our speaker for tonight and our special guest. We're happy to have with us Dr. Kenneth Shapiro. Dr. Shapiro is the executive director of Society and Animals Forum, formerly called Psychologists for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. This is a nonprofit group dedicated to the enrichment and protection of both human and non-human animal lives, and believes this can occur only via the strengthening of the ethical and scientific basis of our attitudes, feelings, behaviors, and interactions. It supports all people who strive to enhance human compassion and to enrich the world via respect not only for each other, but for all non-human animals as well. Dr. Shapiro is the editor of Society and Animals, Journal of Human-Animal Studies. He's the co-editor of the Journal of Applied Animal Welfare Science. He got his undergraduate degree at Harvard University. He grew up in Quincy, a suburb of Boston, a part of Boston, so Harvard was just maybe the nearest reasonable school to go to. After that, he got his doctor's degree in clinical psychology from Duke University. And his most recent book is Animal Models of Human Psychology: Critique of Science, Ethics, and Policy. He is here today with his wife Anne and son Joel, and it's time to welcome Dr. Kenneth Shapiro. Somebody does that here.
Thank you, Carl, for that gracious introduction. I want to thank the Society for allowing me and my family to come to Hawaii, something that we really looked forward to do. And I want to thank Jim Brown for his flexibility in allowing us to coordinate this visit with attendance at the American Psychological Association conference held in Honolulu a few days ago. I want to thank my wife and son for navigating me to this spot in a metaphoric sense. I am a vegetarian. I am a vegetarian. Of course, that means that I don't eat meat. But does it also mean that I have certain beliefs, certain values? Does it mean that I have a certain personality, a self-concept of a particular kind? Does it influence the way in which I relate to other people? These are the questions that I want to entertain with you this evening. So the title of this talk is Psychology of the Dinner Table, Vegetarianism and Carnism. So let me set the stage. You folks will play the part of the audience. Okay? And as I understand it, some of you are vegetarians, some of you are vegans perhaps, some of you are on the path to becoming vegetarians, some of you are drifting toward vegetarianism, as they say, vegetarian drift. Some of you are meat eaters, some of you have eaten less meat, some of you are just interested in this out of curiosity, some of you are seriously entertaining possibility of becoming a vegetarian. So that's the audience. I'll play the part of the narrator, the kind of Greek chorus, okay? I am a vegetarian, I am a psychologist, and I am an animal advocate. In this talk, I'm going to try to be less upfront about advocacy and be more the psychologist. So I'm going to use evidence from the literature, sparse as it is, on the psychology of vegetarianism. I'm going to use the empirical studies, quite limited in number. I'll also use case materials that has been published. And occasionally, I will simply speculate. We need a psychology of vegetarianism. We are beginning to develop a field called human-animal studies. And in that field, we will have people who will take up this topic. So the last part of the stage is the stage itself, the actors. And I'm going to ask you to imagine this because I didn't bring all my props. Oh, I'm not supposed to wander from this spot, I'm sorry. Okay, I'm supposed to hold the mic just like this. I have to do all these things so I can't think about what I'm going to say.
You got to smile, too.
Smile? Oh, this is difficult. So imagine with me, there's a table here, 4 chairs, table is completely set, 4 people sitting around, they've eaten the first course. There's a barrier here, there's 2 separate rooms. There's another table here, 4 people sitting around, and they've had their first course. So, let me tell you about the one table first. This is a table of vegetarians. They've had their first course. It is a lovely Armenian soup made with red lentils and apricots and a base, which is a vegetarian base. And for the main dish, which they are about to be served, they are having a stir-fry made with the vegetables in season and a lovely setting sauce made out of milled almonds, so the almonds become like a flour, and soy milk, and some brags or tamari, and some wine, and lots of black pepper. You can't use too much black pepper. The other table, they've had their first course, and what they have had is a shrimp cocktail. This is named that way because it's usually served at the beginning of the meal with drinks. And the sauce is a kind of yuppie version of a barbecue sauce. they'd had that. They're about to be served their main dish. Their main dish is braised beef. This is made with a gravy consisting of the drippings of the former animal, and it is made with flour and some kind of liquid, often milk. That's what they're having. So this is a table of vegetarians, and this is a table of, I'm going to use the term carnist for meat eater. And I'm making a clear distinction between vegetarian and meat eater, even though, as I just mentioned a moment ago, people are in different places along the path to the possibility of becoming vegetarian. But for the purposes of this exposition, vegetarian or carnist. Okay? So the question we're raising is simply, what are the differences between the people at this table and the people at this table, not in what they're eating, that's obvious, but in other psychological aspects? Of course, there's great individual differences between these four vegetarians and these four carnists, but are there some average group aspects that distinguish this group from this group, the kinds of things that social scientists could get their hands on and study? That's what we want to know. Let me begin with some demographics. These are just more dry-like kinds of features about people, and we do have some data on this. Most vegetarians are... What's the most important variable in distinguishing a vegetarian from a carnist? They're women. 70% of the vegetarians are women. I'm looking around this audience and I don't see that really. No, it looks more even than that. They tend to be middle class, more than the general population. They tend to be professional, more than the general population. Educated. They tend to be, more than the general population, progressive, some form of a little bit to the left, that rather than a little bit to the right. So we know that. Those things we know. But, again, do they differ in more psychological, experiential characteristics? Are there aspects of their way of being, their way of experiencing the world, the way of experiencing themselves, their body, other people, nature, animals, that distinguish them from them? I'm going to have to talk about the carnist way of being as well as the vegetarian way of being, because the vegetarian way of being is largely a rejection of the carnist way of being. So let me begin with what I call a paradox, a vegetarian paradox. This is a kind of organizing theme for what I'm going to say in the talk. For the vegetarian at the dinner table, no animals other than humans are there. But in a sense, animals are psychologically present. For the carnist, there are many animals and animal parts present, but psychologically, there are no animals present. A paradox. This is important, so let me say a little bit more about it. Let me try to explain it a little bit and give some examples. For the vegetarian, there are no actual animals or animal parts present, but animals are present as absent. The vegetarian is very conscious of not eating animals and of the animals not eaten. An example from another context. You are planning a dinner engagement with a significant other, a small dinner party, very important event. You get a call 2 hours before. It's a no-show. So you're sitting there at the dinner table, and you have a sense of the other person in their empty wine glass as present as absent. Present as absent. Okay? Now, for the vegetarian, it's similar. The animals are present as absent. But what's different in this example of the vegetarian is that the vegetarian is glad. He or she is celebrating the absence of the animals, but consciously aware of that absence. Oppositely, for the carnist at the dinner table, there are actual animals or animal parts present: shrimp, chicken, cow. But animals are not psychologically present. The animals are not sensed or felt. They're not posited. They're not looked at focally as animal. There's just something to be eaten. An example again from another context. The logger sees so many cords of wood and no longer the wood as living trees. The animal researcher sees the physiological process or the data point, but no longer the laboratory rat. So again, for the carnist, the animals are not present. They're forgotten. There's just something to be eaten. Just the flesh of a formerly living animal. So I'm going to use this as an organizing theme, and I'm going to make two kinds of arguments. One is that the being of a vegetarian is deep. What a psychologist means by that is that it's not just a behavior. It's self-concept. It's belief, value, ideology, way of relating. All of that stuff, psychologists say, has depth. So I'm going to say that there's a way of being, a depth to being a vegetarian. And the other point I'm going to try to make through raising the question, because we don't have data on it really, is this vegetarian way of being more healthy psychologically or less healthy psychologically than the way of being of the carnist? We're going to raise that question and try to see if we can come to some speculative answer about that. So those are the two questions. So let me begin with describing the relation to self of the vegetarian, the self-concept. I am a vegetarian. It's part of the way I would introduce myself. It's part of the way I did introduce myself. It's a major part of my self-concept. So the first point is that for the vegetarian, being a vegetarian is an important part of the self-concept. That's not trivial. That's important. It's as important as being, I am a psychologist. Okay? I am a Democrat. I'm a vegetarian. It's important. Not so for the carnist, much less so. Carnists usually don't say, in most contexts, I am a carnist. They don't say they're a meat eater. Another important part of self-concept, and I'm going to say more about this, but let me just introduce it. To become a vegetarian is to develop a story about yourself. Psychologists recently have discovered, they're always discovering the obvious, that the way in which we define ourselves is in the form of a narrative, a story. I was born so-and-so, I was interested in this, I became a vegetarian, I have these kinds of beliefs and views. To become a vegetarian is to develop and integrate into the story of your life vegetarianism. That's a major task. It's not done overnight. Let me ask you this then. Another aspect of self-concept are your motives and your interests and your values. I noticed in the intro, Carl indicated that there's 3 interests or motives, reasons for being a vegetarian in the mission statement. How many folks here who are vegetarian or on the way to becoming vegetarian primarily are motivated by health? How many are primarily motivated by animal rights? How many are primarily motivated by environmental concerns? Pretty good split. Environmental maybe a little bit less. From what I understand in the literature, 10 or 20 years ago it was primarily health. So these are motives, but they're also interests. If you're motivated out of health interests, you begin to develop that as an interest. You begin to read about it and talk about it and think about it, and it becomes a value for you. It's important. It's a good thing to be healthy through vegetarianism. It's a good thing to be helping animals through vegetarianism. So this is part of our self-concept as well. These different motives and interests and values have different trajectories. Some people start in health and move to other interests like animal rights, and vice versa. There's a subgroup of vegetarians, new vegetarians, who are a little bit different than this, and I just want to mention them. They are increasingly in the literature, and you increasingly run into this, particularly on college campuses. Adolescents are becoming vegetarian. And their motives, there's reason to believe, are a little bit different. They have the anti-establishment, anti-patriarchy kind of motive, as well as, believe it or not, there's a certain status associated with being a vegetarian. Now that's a switch. So we can evaluate these motives, interests, and values in terms of psychological health, and I'm going to do that in a moment. A second aspect of the vegetarian way of experiencing the world is one's relationship to nature and to other animals, to the natural world. There's a couple of references I just want to mention in terms of the history of vegetarianism. One by Spencer, called A Heretic's Feast, and the other by Fox, and that is called Deep Vegetarianism. And I use those to make these couple of remarks about the history of vegetarianism. Pythagoras is very important in that. In fact, before the term vegetarian was coined, and it was coined in modern times, vegetarians were often called Pythagoreans. In any case, there was a theme to that early vegetarianism. And Pythagoras believed in the migration of souls, transmigration. The theme was the connectedness of all human and non-human beings. And those souls were connected, and the way in which you lived your life, particularly the ethical way in which you lived your life, formed your soul in the next life. So you might be fortunate enough to become a dolphin in your next life. Now these animal forms were hierarchically arrayed, and of course you'll never guess what was on top. But in any case, it was an important idea that gave the sense of connectedness. Other traditions, religious traditions like animism, had a similar idea. Not transmigration of the souls, but the soul of God in every living being. So we were all part of that. Again, the connectedness, a kind of mystic union. Contemporary vegetarians, although they don't use as often the vocabulary of souls, have a sense of the connectedness of life, of a close relationship with living beings. There's a couple of different contexts of this. Sometimes, in a sense, they bring the other animals to us, to human. In companion animals, the companion animals are connected to us. They're part of our family, the human family. But sometimes in the more environmental context, the humans go to the other animals. We are all part of nature, connected that way. With this, there's a certain pervasiveness of animals in the experience of the vegetarian. Even with our no animals, as we saw a moment ago, no animals at the table. Animals have a certain presence, a spiritual presence. The dinner table is a special place. It's a kind of sanctuary where there are no animals being exploited. But for the vegetarian, there's a sense of the exploitation of animals outside of that sanctuary. And there's a project of extending that dinner table so that there is a greater sanctuary. But vegetarians are very aware of the exploitation of animals. One of the vehicles in psychological terms of this sense of the pervasiveness and connectedness is that vegetarians are more often to identify with other animals. They find a part of themselves in other animals, as, for example, I find a part of my Father in me when I am stubborn and persistent. And I find a part of my favorite English teacher in my love of literature. I have identified with that important being and taken it in as part of myself. Vegetarians identify with other living beings. They recognize the commonality that we all have feelings, that we all relate. We have formed relationships, that we can feel frustration, that we can suffer. So there's that identification. Another important psychological feature is that vegetarians are more likely to empathize, to take the perspective of another living being. Not so the carnist. The carnist does not empathize with the cellophaned piece of meat in the supermarket and move to the perspective of that which is some confined factory farm situation in which that being was raised. The empathic move is not made. The history of our species shows some of these issues and how they changed. It's generally believed that we began as vegetarians before we were Homo sapiens, and that we moved from that to a kind of scavenger, following after some other animals, picking up the parts, eating berries and grubs and remains of animals. We then became nomadic hunters and gatherers. At that time, the hunting part was a small part of our diet. We didn't eat that much meat. We couldn't. But later, we domesticated first grains and then animals. And still, meat was not a central part of our diet, but animal byproducts were. And with domestication, there was a sense, an attitude, a relationship toward nature, which was that we are powerful over it. We are successful in that we have domesticated these animals, and we have a lot of them. The word cattle and the word chattel are related. I have a lot of cattle, I have a lot of property, I am powerful. Again, here, the identification is diminished. I am dominant over these other beings, I eat them, I do not identify with them. One other part of this theme, one other theme here is presented by a guy named Fiddes, F-I-D-D-E-S, a book called Meat, a Natural Symbol. He talks about a masculine worldview in which there's a domination in the relationship to animals and nature. The history of the dinner table itself shows some of this progression. Traditionally, early history, the whole pig was on the table. You served the whole pig with the head and the face and the apple and the so forth, and other whole animals, the partridge and so forth. And then, through this history, they began to conceal the animal more and more. Steak, red with blood, and then the stroganoff, just the concealed pieces of meat. Began to conceal it and to identify less and less with the animal. The supermarket concealed the animal, the cellophane. The slaughterhouses themselves were concealed, pushed to the edge of town. So the carnist is less likely to identify and empathize. He or she has also forgotten this dominance issue. When you ask a carnist why they eat meat, they say, it's because it tastes good and it's healthy. They don't talk about dominance. Okay, let me get then at the relationship between vegetarianism and how we form our social relationships. To do that, I'm going to talk about the development of vegetarianism, the stages that we go through to become a vegetarian. Most often, when people turn to vegetarianism, they do so because they're ready, in a sense. They're ready for a change. They're secure in some ways. Sometimes it happens during a crisis and change occurs, but more often there's a certain readiness, and you'll understand why you need to be ready as I go through this description, because it's a big change. Part of being ready is having materials to read. Part of being ready is to have a supportive community like the society. When asked, 40% of the people say that they made the change because of the support of a literature, if you will. 40% made the change because of a community of people that they recognize would support them. So the first stage involves a critical awareness. The vegetarian makes the connection between meat on the plate and the once living animal. Now, they may have already known this, but it's made in an emotional way. They really see it. It's a shock of recognition. And they begin to make explicit the connection between eating meat and the suffering of animals. The inconsistency begins to bother. Let me read a brief description of some moment of critical awareness. This is from a book by Towns called, I don't remember the exact title. It has the word garden in it. I just looked at that bone and suddenly felt sick. Everything had come together. The realization that what I eat affects the world. The knowledge that there were people out there who did not in fact eat animals. And the sudden understanding that a piece of meat was in fact a piece of a dead animal. So there's this shock of recognition, this sense, it's like biting the apple. You suddenly see it in a way that it takes hold of you, and you have to do something about it. It's a violent moment in the sense of breaking away from what you had traditionally believed. But there's problems in this initial stage. The problems center around social relations. The shock of recognition is matched by a jolt in your human relations. People are puzzled by it, or taken aback by it, or don't know how to react to it. Their association to vegetarianism is marginal groups, weirdos, stuff like that. 65% of the people report there's a negative reaction from other people when they announce they're being a vegetarian. It's like coming out in a sense. So they get these weird looks and ridicule and so forth. So there's an unreadiness as well as a readiness that strikes you. You have the behavior, you stopped eating meat, at least in some degree. But you don't yet have the material, the story, to deal with other people. You don't know how to negotiate with them. You don't know how to present this position articulately. You're searching yourself for how to do it practically and how to talk about it, and it doesn't work yet. One of the reasons that there's a particular problem in social relations in becoming a vegetarian, rather than economic reasons or the like, is that the dinner table is a focal point of social relations. It's a moment of intimacy. The word companion means pan, bread, com, with, breaking bread with, being with, companion. Okay? So there's a link there in the etymology of that word with food, bread, and relationships. So there's an intimacy to our eating dinner, and when you introduce this change, there's a disruption of that intimacy. Many vegetarians have their Thanksgiving story. I have my Thanksgiving story. It's mostly told in terms of where the turkey was. We traditionally ate dinner with my brother and his family, my sister-in-law and her family. The turkey in the center of the table, and Ken at the end of the table with his little corner there, and his boiled vegetables. But anyway, after a while, the turkey was served off the table, and they brought the turkey on. Okay? And then later, we didn't have Thanksgiving with my brother's family. But we still get on. And in fact, ironically, the extreme of this, the Thanksgiving story, is that there's a vegetarian society where I live in Maryland where there's an annual potluck. And there's turkeys at the dinner. I mean, turkeys walking around. So you're not ready for that. You haven't yet developed your story. And then let me try to be psychological one more time at the risk of boring you. There's a dynamic here which is really interesting and needs to be studied. Becoming a vegetarian is implicitly rejecting something that's very important to carnists, eating meat. You're growing awareness. The connections you're making are ones they're not making. They don't like to hear that. And they respond counter-offensively with their own views of your inconsistency in response to your views of their inconsistency. But, to grow these vegetables, don't you have to kill the earthworms? Okay. So, you in response, in that you're not yet well versed in being a vegetarian and relating as a vegetarian, you might respond defensively, self-righteously, indignantly, hostilely. So there's this dynamic that goes on. And now I want to then comment on the issue of psychological health. When psychologists say defensively, they don't just mean how you're interacting with each other. They mean something a little bit deeper. A defense is a part of your personality structure. It's how you adjust to the world. And it takes psychological energy to defend. And the question is, are carnists using up more energy, sapping their psychological energy to be carnists? Or are vegetarians sapping their psychological energy in order to maintain their vegetarianism? This is an interesting kind of question. There is a doctoral dissertation on this, which I read with great eagerness. It's limited evidence because it's a very small group of people that was studied, but it's really a fascinating idea. Melanie Joy is her name, her thesis is that the inconsistencies she thinks are inherent in the carnist position. I'm against suffering, but not with those animals. I'm against suffering with respect to my dog, but not the pig. Those kind of inconsistencies, she says, require a kind of defense, a kind of distortion or denial of reality. Takes energy, saps energy. Okay? I don't know. The other argument is that the defensiveness is on the vegetarian side. I've already hinted at that. The cultural consensus, after all, is to eat meat. The question is this socialization into eating meat so successful that it requires no psychic energy to do it? You just do it. That's how it is. I mean, you don't question it. And there's no deep sense in which it's inconsistent from your point of view. I don't know. But in that point of view, it's the veggie that is the cultural aberration and has to do all the work of defending himself and so forth. So I'm not sure about this. My sense is, and we'd love to be able to show this, my sense is that in the later stages of vegetarianism, the stabilized vegetarian is in better shape in terms of this defenses issue and really is at peace with it, connected and so forth and so on. The transitional stage, that was the initial stage, the transitional stage. In the transitional stage, you really do the work of learning how to be a vegetarian from a practical point of view. That's gotten much easier than in my day. There's so much stuff available now, so many products, it's just wonderful. Although we did have an awful lot of trouble in the Ala Moana food court. I can't believe that they have to use a fish base in every soup in the entire food court. And that they were called vegetarian. One usually goes through a pattern of becoming a vegetarian more and more. You're familiar with that, from the giving up the veal to the giving up the meat to giving up the chicken, fish, shelled fish, dairy, eggs. And this can take years. It took me years to do that. And that's a problem of education and a problem of learning how to cook and so forth and so on. As I say, it's gotten much easier. But the bigger task in this middle stage is to develop the story. I went to Alaska and I saw the plight of endangered animals. And I made the connection between those animals and how I eat. Da 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 da. One story. Just a piece of it. Another story. I was very ill last year. I'm making these up. Please don't feel sorry for me. I was very ill last year. I went to the doctors. I read the literature on this illness. It turns out, in the literature, there's some connection between this illness and my diet. This is my story. I'm a vegetarian. You develop a story. The story includes a critique of meat eating on various grounds. It might be different grounds. It's an ideology. It's a set of values. But you have to develop that, and you have to be more or less articulate with it, because people won't let you get away with it. They will not let you get away with it. You need to experiment with a way of interacting that's not too aggressive and not too proselytizing and missionary. And you have to find your own style, obviously, but there's a lot of work to doing that. I mean, I was not a very nice guy at the time. I was very flippant and aggressive, and it was not easy for me to relate to the carnist. Other people have more skills. Your general people skills will help, but you're going to have to work that out, and it may require some changes in the way you interact. So you start making some compromises and start being less strident. And then instead of people saying, I don't know what to give you to eat. What can I do? I don't know how to feed you. With this patronizing kind of. Instead of that, they're saying to you, I understand that you can make that wonderful soup. How do you make that sauce? Well, the sauce is made with such and such and such. No meat. At this point in this transitional stage, it begins, ironically, to be harder to turn back. You start presenting yourself as vegetarian, and then you pull out your meatball sub, you got a problem socially. So there starts to be some pressure on you, even from the meat-eating social group. Intimate relations. As I mentioned, eating and intimacy very much linked. Nearly half of a sample of vegetarians refuse to date carnists. Mixed partners, one a vegetarian, one a carnist. More often the woman vegetarian. Who does the cooking? Okay? But there's arguments there, and there's tension there, and you're not going to cook twice, and if you want to eat this, and all kinds of permutations, and that has to be worked out. It's not a simple task, and there's probably going to have to be some compromises. 85% of people in mixed marriages report some problems around this issue. 85%. The interesting thing about vegetarianism is that it's a visible way of being. If you think of the kinds of differences that the culture emphasizes, gender, visible, generally. Ethnicity, visible, generally. Okay? Vegetarianism, more visible than you think. Your boss asks you out for lunch, and he takes you to the fish house. It's visible, isn't it? You're not going to eat the fish. That's the specialty of the house. I don't eat fish. I have nothing but respect for fish. Huh? What? You try to work these things out, and in this stage, I think, this middle stage, you're seeking a balance between a kind of distinctiveness. I am a vegetarian, and a kind of integration with your present social community, which is, I'm just one of the guys. I just happen to... In the final phase, it crystallizes. A large part of your self-concept becomes that I am a vegetarian. I don't need to go through the positive features of that way of being. Other people have lectured on that, the health benefits, the longevity benefits, and so forth. But psychological benefits, in the broad sense that I've been using the term psychological here, which has to do with how you experience the world, not just your behavior. The self you're gaining comfort in yourself. You have a sense that you made an important choice, a sense of self-directedness, of self-control. Empowerment is the word they use. And there's an interesting kind of irony, in a sense, that most people, when they think about being a vegetarian, they think about self-denial. You mean you can't eat that? And you don't generally experience it as self-denial. Maybe you do, but I don't think a lot of vegetarians, when in the stabilized position, they don't think of it that. It's a kind of liberation through constraint. That word in Hawaiian that is used historically, kupa, is it? K-U-P-A? Is that the right word? What? Kapu. It means rules that prohibit, taboos. People think of vegetarian as involving a great set of constraints. But this liberation in the sense of self, that you've taken charge. You've had the courage to move in this direction. In terms of your relationship to the world, the natural world, I think there's a strong distinction between those vegetarians who are primarily in it for health, self-development, spiritual growth and stuff like that. Those folks begin to feel a compassion for the rest of the world, and they have a spiritual well-being and reverence for life and the like. I think nonviolence becomes an important part of that spiritual vegetarianism. The other folks who are primarily involved in vegetarianism because of the animal rights and the environment, it's a little bit different perhaps. They have a sense of engagement, of the meaning of their life in a social context, that they're committed to do something to change something about the world. But again, a very self-fulfilling position. In terms of social relations, a much less aggressive, more humorous, more playful, more tolerant way of being a vegetarian, of getting along with others. Modeling for them, showing them, without intruding. There's negatives. On the physiological side, on the health side, there are junk food vegetarians. Amongst adolescents, there are vegetarians who are skirting with the eating disorder problem. They're using the vegetarianism as a cover for an eating disorder. I've mentioned a number of the negative possibilities in the course of the talk, but again, there's a possibility of adopting a kind of self-righteous, indignant position, a kind of condescension, a moral superiority, stuff like that. Hostility, anger at people for doing what they're doing in not being a vegetarian. See that in the animal rights movement, unfortunately. A new kind of aspect that I would see as a negative in vegetarianism is a kind of elitism, yuppie consumerism. People spend an awful lot of time, trying to find the right vitamin, the right this, and the vitamins were produced by this, and not eating this, and they're just almost preoccupied with their own belly through vegetarianism. And I think that's a loss of the moral thrust and the spiritual thrust that the history of vegetarianism reflects. Then there's relapsed vegetarianism. And there's a whole book on this now, amazingly. There's a book by a philosophy person on a group of people that she studied who were vegetarians and then left the fold for various reasons. But the ironic thing about them is that in the terms that I'm describing it here tonight, they are vegetarians even though they eat meat, because they have the connectedness and they have the critical awareness, but for various reasons they're eating some meat. Whereas the person who can't afford to buy meat and doesn't eat meat, in my terms, is not a vegetarian, because they don't have this psychology. Okay, there's one other topic I want to hit, and this is a topic that I'm quite interested in, but I have not really developed. This is largely speculative. Aesthetics. The aesthetics of being a vegetarian. Plato talked about beauty, truth, and goodness as three ideals, and he kept them somewhat separated. Keats talked about beauty is truth and truth is beauty. He connected them. I'm going to try to keep them separate for a moment. Let's just talk about vegetarianism and what the vegetarian experiences as beautiful and what the vegetarian experiences as ugly, the aesthetics of being a vegetarian. And are those aesthetics richer, more vibrant than the aesthetics of the carnist? Obviously, our tastes in foods, what we find beautiful or tasteful in foods and ugly, distasteful, are largely culturally determined. But there's an interesting branch of research, topic in research, that's being developed on disgust. And disgust, it is claimed, is an innate sense of what's ugly, distasteful. The word disgust, for those of you who are into words, you can see has the word G-U-S-T, gustatory. It's related to taste. It's related to eating. Gustatory function is the eating function. Okay? So disgust primarily is and was a response to what you take in, what you incorporate. And it primarily is a response to the taking in of other living, sentient beings. Not asparagus, but cows. Disgusting. Disgusting. When you see the veins in the meat, when you see the fat, when you chew the fat, disgusting, okay? So, it may be that part of the defensiveness of the carnist is to forget, to suppress that disgust response. But on the other hand, vegetarians report, and certainly carnists report, this notion of meat craving, meat hunger, a specific impulse to eat meat. I'm missing meat is what I'm missing. I crave meat. Okay? Now that is an argument in the other direction, isn't it? And the vegetarian very often reports missing meat in the early stages. And I can remember as a carnist when I was young, when I became a vegetarian, I didn't feel filled eating the vegetables, and I was missing something. And for a long time, the center of my diet was meat substitutes. I was trying to find stuff that was meaty. And the vegetables I liked were the meaty vegetables, the eggplant. But I find in the course of being a vegetarian in the later stages, meat becomes repulsive. So then the question is that realization of the disgust of meat evidence of the vegetarian breaking through the defenses that the carnist has, the defenses against the innate disgust of meat? So that when you arrive at this position of finding meat repulsive again, as a vegetarian, you are undefended. You are together. Bit of a stretch, isn't it? There's some positive arguments for the richness of the carnist palate. Obviously, particularly in the West, the cuisines are largely meat-centered. Think of Julia Child without the fish or the meat. Okay? So that there's a more articulate aesthetic of meat-based foods for the carnist that he or she can appreciate. Logically, if you're a carnist, you eat meat and vegetables. And if you're a vegetarian, you eat vegetables. So who has more choices? Who has the richer aesthetic possibility? But of course, we're not being logical here, are we? We're being psychological. Good. So the psychology of it. Vegetarians discover that meat is a very, very powerful, overriding smell, taste, sensation. When you're eating meat, there's just vegetables. You don't discriminate between Brussels sprouts and asparagus and peas. You can't taste them. They're just vegetables. Okay? The vegetarian, pushing away that powerful center of the dish, becomes aware that these many vegetables and fruits and grains and nuts and seeds and so forth have textures and tastes and smells and freshnesses and delicacies and so forth and so on. So there's an argument there for an enhanced, enriched aesthetic for the vegetarian. Oftentimes in the case materials I read, the vegetarians use the metaphor of lightness. The food they're eating is lighter, not as filling. Lighter, more delicate. The meat is heavy. There's a possible throwback to the masculine-feminine distinction there. Men eat meat. It's heavy. It's filling. Women eat quiche, salad, and so forth. But this light-heavy, it seems to me, is a metaphor for the vegetarian way of experiencing the world. You tread lightly. You are connected to the rest of the world, and you don't want to tread heavily on it. You have a sense of the truth of the exploitation of animals, of the suffering involved. You have a sense of the goodness involved in being a vegetarian, and you have a sense of the beauty of it. So I think Plato would be happy with us. Okay, I'll stop there and take questions.
Thank you, Dr. Shapiro. Questions? Here we are.
In regards to the first question, I certainly agree. There are many traditional subcultures that have a strong connection to nature and eat meat. And we know of totemic traditions where there was a strong identification with certain animals, and one revered those animals, identified with them, the Bear Clan or the like, and the Native American Indian relationship with the buffalo. They identified with that animal, and they ate that animal. But they did it with a certain reverence and awe and a sense of connectedness. So I'm not arguing that vegetarians are the only ones who feel this connectedness, but I'm just arguing that it is a feature of their eating. And I'm arguing that the contemporary, urbanized, industrial meat eater does not feel the connectedness. Thank you very much. Aloha.
Thank you, Dr. Shapiro. As usual, we have refreshments. Please stay to enjoy those provided by Down to Earth. Please hang around to talk to our speaker a little bit. And thank you very much for coming.
This program is brought to you by the Vegetarian Society of Hawaii, a nonprofit organization dedicated to sharing with the community the many benefits of a vegetarian diet. Free monthly meetings include vegetarian experts found locally and on the mainland, quick and easy cooking demonstrations, and healthful and delicious food samples. Members enjoy an informative quarterly newsletter, social activities, and discounts at many vegetarian-friendly restaurants and health food stores. For an application, call 944-8344. That's 944-8344. Or visit our website at www.vsh.org. vsh.org.